Hello, and welcome to part 3 of our SASB implementation webinar series. I'm Neil Stewart, Director of Corporate Outreach for SASB.
And I'm Mark Siegel. I'm a partner at EY, but also a member of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board.
And I'm Sophia Mendelson. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for JetBlue Airways and a tried and true warrior in the ESG reporting space.
Thank you, Sophia. And first, to our audience from around the world, we hope you're staying safe and well during these extraordinary times. Over 3,000 people from more than 75 countries have registered for this webinar series, primarily sustainability officers and ESG consultants, as well as investors, IR, and legal folks, sharing a common interest, ESG standards that are industry specific, financially material, consistent through time, and comparable across companies. And sharing a common goal. And by that, I don't just mean ESG reporting, I also mean improving ESG performance. Now, looking at our agenda today, this webinar is part 3 in a 4-part series that's designed to guide companies on the path to implementing SASB standards. We kicked it off a month ago with an overview and roadmap featuring BlackRock. Next, we broke down the structure of the standards and how to get started. Replays of both webinars are available on the Knowledge Hub on the SASB website. Today, where, when, and what to report, looking at the different channels for SASB reporting, spotlighting JetBlue Airways as an example of a standalone SASB report, and showing other examples of innovative and effective reporting. Now, a recording of this webinar with the slides will be made available via an email to all registrants. And we invite participants to submit your questions throughout the program. We'll take as many as possible. Please type your questions into the box on your screen. Today, we're really focused on implementing SASB standards, and we have limited time. So I'm sorry if we have to omit any questions that are outside of that scope. Now, before we get to the heart of today's discussion, let's go on to a quick fire round. Mark and I are going to briefly address FAQs from the first 2 parts of this webinar series. Over 1,000 listeners on each of those webinars, hundreds of questions. These are the ones that were asked many times in different ways. So let's knock these out in a quick fire round. And first up, I'll take this one. We got this a lot. How many companies and which companies in my industry are using SASB standards? Now, it's easy to find out. Go to the SASB reporters page on our website. You can filter by industry, link straight through to the latest reports. And if you're a SASB reporter and you're not on there, just email us, info@sasb.org. Mark, over to you for the next one. What if a company believes a metric is missing from its industry standard or would simply like to report on another topic it thinks is important?
Sure. You know, the beauty of the current voluntary nature of these standards is that companies have the flexibility to add, to supplement the SASB metrics with other metrics. In fact, I'd encourage companies so that in addition to the SASB standards, feel free to highlight whatever measures of progress you think are most relevant to you to show progress toward your unique long-term value plan.
Good. All right, next, should you wait to report until you have everything in your standard, or should you report on what you have and be transparent about what you're lacking? And I can tell you that the mantra, and this comes straight from the institutional investors asking for SASB reporting. The mantra is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, or don't let perfection stand in the way of progress. Investors really want companies to get started and improve over time, and our standards application guidance explains clearly how any omissions or modifications can be handled along your journey. Mark, this next one is also a common concern. A company goes to the SASB website, looks up its industry, downloads the standard, but what if the company is in more than one industry? Can it use multiple standards?
Yeah, Neil, this is one we get all the time. You know, since the standards are set based on what's most likely or more likely to be financially material in each sector, if you're in multiple sectors, you should feel free to look at the sectors that correspond to the businesses that you're in. And that doesn't mean you need to disclose 30 different metrics for all 3 or 4 of the different sectors that you operate in. The company always has the ultimate decision point around materiality. And so the company would look at those different sectors and would then decide which are the most relevant for them based on their own facts and circumstances.
Great. Now, finally, where can my company get help with SASB implementation? Now, I want to say, first of all, that SASB has a lot of resources on our website. You should explore our Knowledge Hub. And this year we launched an interactive implementation primer that takes you step by step through the process, including very useful worksheets that can be downloaded. But I want to emphasize that as a standard setter, SASB doesn't consult for companies. The standards are free to download, free to use. We don't provide paid for services to issuers. What we can do is answer any specific questions that you have about the standards or technical protocols or the application guidance. You can email me directly or email info@sasb.org. And if I don't know the answer, I'll get it to you from one of our sector analysts who create and maintain the standards. There are, of course, many third-party experts who can help. And as we saw, around a third of our listeners are ESG consultants or from the accounting profession. So from large accounting firms to consulting firms to independent consultants, there's really a deep pool of expertise out there. And Mark, maybe you could chime in. What are some, from materiality assessment to actually writing the report, what kind of help do companies get from third parties?
Soup to nuts, Neil. We talk to companies from the very beginning. From pre-IPO, how do we stand up an ESG platform? How do we think about it from the start, all the way to the more sophisticated ones who are trying to refine, take it to the next level, take the materiality assessment to the next level, take the reporting to the next level, as well as obviously assurance. How do we assure and prove to the market that the data quality inherent in the report is up to the same level of standards that we have for our financial reporting.
Okay, let's get on with our program now. And really one of the key questions to decide on, which is where to disclose. Mark, right up front, perhaps you could dispel the myth that SASB standards are only intended to go in financial filings.
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the ones where perception lags reality for a while. So there is no there is no intention that SASB standards have to be put in the financial filings. This is a very big deal in the U.S. In particular, but even across the world. It does not mean that SASB standards have to be in the financial filings or in the 10K or in the annual report. Each communication channel for reporting has its own unique strengths and weaknesses. So it is important, and one of the things in the implementation primer is to try to figure out where you want to communicate these things and to whom you want to communicate, who are the most important stakeholder groups, and fit your SASB communication in with the stakeholders that you're trying to reach most importantly. Importantly to me, the ESG story should not be siloed and disconnected from the company's overall equity narrative. So whatever you end up deciding about what channel to put it in, to me, it's pretty important that ESG issues are business issues after all. And even more so during the times in which we live right now, with COVID and the civil unrest that we've got, so these should not be disconnected stories from the company's own story. It is possible that you might want to reference the fact that you have these SASB standards in multiple channels, even if you only list them in one. The SASB metrics fit into the overall package of showcasing the company's progress toward long-term value creation, which obviously contains financial information, but it also contains indirectly financial components too, including things like SASB, which are indirectly financially, which come into play and we think are financially material for many of the items over the longer term. So the next slide, this one is so which one is right for my company? And so there's lots of companies talk about there being a large number of potential frameworks or standards or rating agencies to be concerned with. Obviously, one way to fix that would be that it would be required by the regulator. In the US, that would be the SEC. Most US companies don't want that option. In Europe and other places, it is already mandated. And so some of those questions are answered. But to me, though, what's interesting about this is in that in financial reporting, there's GAAP or IFRS, which is mandated, right? And so everybody's got a set of financial information that's comparable and consistent from one period to another and comparable between one company and another. And yet 90% of companies usually issue non-GAAP information. So even if SASB information were made mandatory or ESG information would be mandatory, I think it would be true the same way that you would have ESG information, but then you'd also have supplemental information to help you tell your story. But because the SASB standards are voluntary, you actually have options. Where do investors want to see this information? Ask them, talk to them, see what your investors are thinking about. What are your competitors doing? If you do benchmarking analysis and look at where your competitors are disclosing the information and which information they're disclosing. For example, we've got the SASB. We'll see the link to the SASB website that's on this slide. We have also, and then the other question is data quality. Is data quality a limiting factor? And almost like what Neil said earlier about don't let perfection be the obstacle toward making progress. Just get started and get on the journey. I'm sure Sophia will talk a little bit about the journey JetBlue had. We have noticed, though, that the data quality and reliability usually become more important the closer the information gets to a regulatory filing, such as the 10K in the US or the annual report outside the US. We have seen, and frankly, investors would perceive that the boards of directors are more involved the closer it gets to the annual report and the regulatory filing, because that board members are actually reading that information very, very closely before they sign off. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great, Mark. So companies really have options what to report, depending on where they're located to some extent. And from an investor's point of view, it's really the data quality that matters and not necessarily the location. Let's go on now to a good practice model of ESG reporting. And for me, JetBlue probably exemplifies the shift in reporting that we've seen over the last decade. That shift that's gone along hand in hand with the widespread integration of ESG into mainstream investing. We've gone from glossy, story-driven sustainability reports to really data-driven, black and white, or in JetBlue's case, black, blue, and white reports that are laser-focused on investor needs. So, Sophia, please take us through the journey that JetBlue has been on.
Sure, absolutely. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sophia from JetBlue Airways. I lead the environmental social governance work for an airline. As you can imagine, doing sustainability at an airline, you get all the facetious comments off the bat. And the response is always that the more externalities, the more carbon emissions, the more you need sustainability and environmental social governance. And I think if the past few weeks have taught us anything, it's that there is no perfect column of E, S, and G, that this is the collective fabric with which society influences business and business influences society. And your report is essentially saying that your board, your senior management understand that business does not operate in a vacuum. Your report is the answer to how your business integrates with society, whether that be through employees, customers, environment, carbon, etc. So the journey of the report parallels the sophistication of the corporate world on these issues. The more sophisticated the company, the more you see their report go to specificity and metrics. As you can see on this slide, JetBlue, like many companies, started with something general, started with something that told our story at a high level. And we knew that this was a step in the right direction, but not all of it. I remember being at a closed door conference years ago of CSOs and someone saying the dirty secret is that the bigger the report, the fewer people read it, and it's somewhere between the choir and the cobwebs. And there's a pretty strong indictment of our own work. So right after that time is when SASB came along and said, yes, we need reporting, but we need it to be more specific. And that's parallels the time when Wall Street began using the term environmental social governance, or ESG, more to say it's not just about the impact that we have on the environment, or that you, the company, have on the environment, but the impact the environment has on the company. Next slide, please. So when JetBlue went with a standalone SASB report, I would love to say it was because we had a long intellectual conversation about it, and all options were on the table. We did have a long intellectual conversation about it, but not all options were on the table. JetBlue was one of the first folks to do a standalone SASB report. And going first is hard. We were not in a place of integration, as almost nobody in the corporate world really was, and to a certain extent still is. So a standalone report versus integrating into our 10K really allowed us to get our foot in the door of sophisticated ESG reporting. It helped put all our internal stakeholders in one place and say, we want to report this in the manner of our financial reporting, but maybe we're not having it audited by EY, so we're putting it separate. And the benefit of the standalone report was that it helped us get started, very much in the mantra of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. The challenge, of course, is that that was 2016, and now it's 2020. So you do see more drive towards integrated reporting now, and as you decide if your client or your company should be doing a standalone report or an integrated report, you do want to look at the competitive landscape that you're operating in. Doing a standalone report is not the same obvious answer it used to be. If all of your competitors, even in one wing of your business or one offshoot of your business, like Amazon Web Services versus fulfillment, are doing integrated reports, then you might want to think about doing SASB within your 10K. Next slide, please. And the big question that I hear a lot, again, behind closed doors, is reporting fatigue or survey fatigue, or which acronym should you use? And I think now more than ever is a time of confusion. So I'd like to just start at the basics. There are a lot of products and acronyms out there. There are a lot of folks looking at scores and reports. Just to state the obvious, there is a difference between a score and a report. There is a difference between a company, very, very good companies, incredibly well-established companies, NASDAQ, S&P, Moody's, writing a report on you from the investor's perspective. Those are all different products, valued and valuable products, not what we're talking about right now. What we're talking about right now is the report that you as the issuer, the issuing company, puts out. And so within that world, people tend to talk about the three acronyms, GRI, SASB, and TCFD. In the financially oriented space, where you're really talking to your shareholders, we find that a combination of SASB and TCFD work well together. These things are built on each other. Please don't think, oh, I'm going to do SASB, and then you see TCFD and you get whiplash and you're not sure which one to go, or you already do CDP. All of these things connect to each other. So if you think about it as an ever-growing circle, you can start with CDP, looking, for example, primarily just at carbon data, and then go to SASB for a larger view of your metrics, and finally wrap it into TCFD for climate risk scenario planning. You can talk to folks like Mark, talk to folks like Neil, call, reach out to TCFD. You can email them, don't literally call them, but they will get on the phone with you and explain how these metrics and these reporting standards work together. Again, for best in class, I would be thinking about a combination of SASB and TCFD. You don't have to take my word for it. When we go to IR and we have these conversations, we come to the conclusion, we get the fact that 80% of our top shareholders request both SASB and TCFD as a combination. Next slide, please. So this really shows the number of years it takes to evolve, and you see a quick jump. There are about 10 years where we were in kind of marketing-oriented reports, and then very quickly it goes from SASB to SASB plus TCFD. Next slide, please. And as professionals on this call, we're 735 professionals on this call. We should expect the pace of change to accelerate. We're going to be asked for more, and that is a good thing. Rather than getting frustrated or fatigued, use SASB and TCFD as your guide to integrate greenhouse gas inventory reporting. And then, yes, I do predict that the corporate world and your top shareholders, especially large institutional shareholders, will be talking about science-based targets and climate risk scenario planning. Again, the thing to remember is that these are congruent with SASB and TCFD. They're not competing. You're not trying to choose between like different restaurants or different products to go to. These are all really marching in the same direction of communicating to your shareholders, owners, and stakeholders how your business is prepared for social and environmental pressures. Next slide, please. And then finally, to wrap up, we should address the elephant in the room, which is corporate America's sudden awakening and embracing of Black Lives Matter on a new level and a new way than it ever has been before. This is one of the hardest parts of ESG for corporations to talk about. And so I implore you not to suddenly put out a new diversity report. Don't stop at just the statement, but look at how the infrastructure of SASB and TCFD is set up, because particularly those are informed by investors. So if you look at how SASB is written, it's driving at metrics, it's driving at materiality. You can take that same mentality and apply it to your company's response and engagement with the Black Lives Matter movement, and in this way bring it all together in one report and feel like you're streamlining and quite frankly save yourself a good bit of time. Neil, I'll pause there and hand it back to you.
Sophia, thank you. And that is really a hard truth, isn't it? The world doesn't need more diversity reports. At this point, it really needs action. We've heard a lot of CEOs speak out, but how can they follow through and drive change? And the big question, do we have the tools to address racial injustice? And the same might be asked of the inequalities that have become so apparent that are being magnified by the impact of COVID-19. And of course, climate change and the extreme measures that's needed there. And my own hope is that our work, and I mean ESG professionals, can help not only monitor ESG issues and report on them, but also drive improvements. Let's go on now to with kind of a jarring shift of focus. That is the kind of shift that we've had to get used to in recent months, but we're going to go look at other examples of SASB reporting. And picking up where we left off, Mark talked earlier about different channels for reporting SASB information. And one interesting trend that we're seeing in the first years when SASB standards were being created, the vast majority of SASB reporting, 81%, was in sustainability reports. But in 2019, the proportion appearing in annual reports more than doubled from 13 to 28%, while regulatory filings such as 10Ks or proxy statements went up fivefold from 3 to 15%. So real signs toward that movement of integration, a convergence of financial and non-financial reporting. And switching from where to report, now let's look at how. So with excerpts from real SASB reporting, one of the strengths of flexible standards like SASB's is the room that they leave for innovation. Mark is now going to take us through a number of examples of that. It's important to remember, though, that these examples are not meant to be templates for other companies to follow. They're really a selection of disclosures that we picked out because they represent unique or interesting approaches that might help companies think differently and think through about what their disclosures could look like. So Mark, in the time that we have before Q&A, and I encourage listeners to type in your questions for Sophia and Mark on the box on your screen. Mark, take us through some good examples.
Sure, and before I get to this first one, I just wanted to re-emphasize the thing that you just said on the last slide with respect to, look, the geography of the disclosure is much less important than the quality of the disclosure and the quality of the information that you're providing. As more and more companies are seeing these issues as more mainstream business issues, they are naturally migrating to the annual reports and to things that are more mainstream communications. And investors are, to Sophia's point, seeming to coalesce around SASB and TCFD. But again, it's more than fine if the disclosures are outside the annual report, which is still, in many of the cases. The main point, at least to me, is that the ESG story should not be disconnected such that the investor gets a completely different story in the CSR report, the sustainability report, as compared to the annual report or to the investor relations deck. So let's talk a little bit about Arch Capital, which a long time ago was a client of mine. It's an insurance company. They do specialty insurance, including directors and officers liability and professional liability, et cetera. And think about from an insurance company's point of view. An insurance company actually has two different parts of the business. They have an asset management part of the business, which I think is really relevant here, because what they are is asset owners, and they are trying to invest to cover very long-term liabilities. In Arch's case, professional liabilities could go over a long time, but if you think about a life insurance company, it's 30 years. And so they're much less worried about whether gross margin, as an asset owner, whether gross margin of the companies that they are invested in go up or down 10 basis points here or there. They're much more interested in, is this company sustainable and going to be around for a long time? And so that's the asset ownership part of the business. And then on the operational side of the business, what their own sustainability is, what they're doing here is they disclose SASB information in a standalone report that's available right on the investor relations website. You don't have to go to a different part of the website. It's right on the investor relations website. And one of the things I wanted to point out here is the pie charts. And the pie charts you see here give readers a very quick, easily accessible, easily digestible sense of the company's relative exposure to various asset classes with different profiles. And so, and I say this about financial information or ESG information, these kinds of charts, tables, infographics in general, they're most useful when they add to the SASB metric by making the information more understandable, more decision useful. They probably shouldn't be used to replace the metric in a company's reporting, because that limits an investor's ability to compare the information across peers. But again, we really like this one because it gives the SASB information, but it also is incremental to that. It adds infographics to try to make it more digestible and easier for an investor to use. So let's go to the next slide, if you would. And let's go to ARC Resources, ARC Resources, and this is a Canadian oil and gas producer. So Sophia said this too. As soon as you say oil and gas or you say airlines, a whole bunch of things come to mind. And so obviously emissions are an important consideration in the oil and gas industry, as are regulatory developments and market forces, as everything is sort of precipitating the transition toward a lower carbon economy. So what ARC Resources does is it discloses SASB information in a sustainability report, a separate sustainability report, which is available on its website. One of the things they do here is they actually disclose absolute numbers, supplementing absolute numbers with these charts. The company is able to give disclosure that gives users a quick snapshot of where the company stands vis-a-vis its peers on the issue of GHG emissions and how well its performance is progressing toward the company's own goal. So seeing this information over time, seeing it benchmarked versus other peers, these again are ways that you are able to demonstrate your progress, either compared to peers or over time. And so it's really additive and incremental to the SASB metric in and of itself, which is just a disclosure, by making the information more understandable, decision useful, adding charts, adding graphs. They don't replace the metric in the company's reporting, but they do make it a lot easier for it to be absorbed and understood by the reader. So I wanted to definitely highlight that one. On the next slide, let's talk about Etsy. Etsy is a US-based online marketplace for handmade crafts. Here, they've taken a completely different approach, and as Sophia mentioned, they've moved toward what she called an integrated report, which basically just means that this information is integrated within the 10K filing, which is the annual regulatory filing in the US. And so they disclose SASB information directly in its Form 10K with the Securities and Exchange Commission. At last year's SASB symposium in December, we had we were lucky enough to have one of the board members there, Peggy Smith, who talked about Etsy's journey. And she specifically made the point that management and the board think of ESG issues as they would any other business issue, and that is why they're very comfortable including this information in part 1 of the 10K as they're talking about their business. Etsy is an e-commerce company. Packaging, distribution, these are obviously key issues for these companies because a significant part of the industry's added value comes from the firm's ability to efficiently move a wide array of goods to consumers who would otherwise have to personally travel to collect them from brick and mortar stores. And so efficiencies in packaging and distribution present opportunities for cost savings that can be passed on to consumers, creating competitive advantage. So for them, it's not just an ESG issue. Again, it's a business issue that creates a competitive advantage for them. And that's why sustainability is a big part of their, reporting and a big part of their business. So one of the things they do here that's helpful, they disclose the information and their performance over several time periods. So that helps all the investors understand the company's trajectory of performance on the issue. You don't otherwise investors would have to themselves go back to last year's 10K, or if we're in another place, go back to a sustainability report and build their own spreadsheet of what the performance is over time. So they actually themselves disclose it over a period of time to make it easier for them to understand, the investors. Another point here, the disclosure includes absolute data. So it shows a year-over-year increase here in the case here of carbon footprint. And that's why it's important for companies to also disclose the activity metrics included in the SASB standards, which actually measures the scale of the company's relevant operations and facilitate comparability. So if you were to normalize the data, basically dividing the data by the number of shipments, the company's revenue, or its total active buyers, you would be able to see more clearly efficiencies gains. This is for financial analysts. This is why you almost always normalize the data, like you think of sales, sales, general, and administrative expenses as a percentage of revenue, cost of sales as a percentage of revenue, and those are called normalized. That's normalized data. The same kind of thing applies here. You're more able to quickly see in normalized data how a company is going, and so here they actually show both. I wanted to move to the next slide on Vornado. Vornado I put here as just an interesting creative example. So we saw companies, we've given examples of companies that have a SASB report standalone. We've had a standalone SASB report both inside the investor relations part of the website, outside of the investor relations part of the website, and then we had Etsy, which did it directly in its annual report in 10K. Vornado had a completely different approach to it, but a creative one and a unique one that I haven't seen much of. Vornado is a realty trust, big North American REIT. They've got property primarily in New York as well as Chicago, San Francisco, and elsewhere. The disclosure quality, first and foremost. They fully implemented the SASB real estate standard. They disclose data for every metric, along with a lot of context and a lot of narrative to facilitate understanding of what the disclosure means. They also actually obtained an examination report from their auditor, Deloitte. And there's lots of different levels of assurance. You can't go higher than an examination report. So they got an examination report to show that their investors that the information is reliable. Now, the location of the disclosure. The company produces an ESG report. It's fairly concise, 40 pages. It's not about how much information, the quantity of the information. It's about the quality of the information and what it's telling you. But one of the things from a location standpoint is it's very interesting that they also decided that they wanted to show that this separate report is still extremely important to them and to the SEC, but they wanted to balance it out with potential litigation risk and that securities lawyers often talk about. So what they did, instead of putting it directly in their 10K, they furnished it to the SEC in an 8K, just like they would any earnings release, any quarter. They actually took their ESG report and furnished it to the SEC in an 8K. Now, I'm not a securities lawyer, so I can't tell you whether that significantly reduces their exposure to litigation risk, et cetera, but it's a unique approach that I've seen that I wanted to make it, to show you guys. So this approach including the quality of the information and the location of the disclosure, that's really a signal that that's an explicit acknowledgement by the company that this information is important to investors, to its own risk management efforts, and frankly, its ability to create value over the long term. So let's move to the next slide. United Natural Foods. So this is the largest publicly traded food wholesaler in North America. It operates both retail locations for ultimate consumers as well as distribution centers. And so that's what DC means in the table there. They disclose their SASB information in a reference table available on its website. So not necessarily in its 10K, not necessarily in a separate sustainability report, directly on its website. Emissions from refrigerants, that's an important part of this industry because that poses regulatory risks, and frankly, replacing outdated equipment can result in significant CapEx or higher operation costs as people change out for more efficient refrigerants over time. So a couple of simple examples of how the breakdown that they give here between retail and distribution centers can be useful. It gives the investors the ability to make an apples to apples comparison between the company's retail operations and other pure play grocers, as well as between distribution centers and other food distributors. So this is just like in financial reporting, where they have segment information that breaks down the business into different pieces of the business. Same kind of thing here. If you're breaking it down, if you're trying to make this useful for investors, if you think of ESG issues as a business issue and not a separate siloed ESG issue, you're going to want to break down your ESG information by business segment. And so that's what they've done here by retail and DC. Also, what you'll see here is 83% of the scope 1 emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions at the company's 63 distribution centers originate from mobile sources. So what does that tell you? That means it's distribution fleet. So the company can use different strategies involving different expenditures to mitigate the risks in each of its key segments. And you don't know that without this breakdown. So this breakdown gives investors, and frankly, by the company managing it this way, it gives the company more options and understanding how they can change their impacts. And it gives investors an understanding about the different levers the companies can pull upon and push upon to change their impacts over time as well. And so this is a good example of going a little bit more down the extra mile of breaking things down by business segment to make it easier for them to measure and manage as for their own business, and for the transparency for investors to understand it. So the next slide, United Urban Investment Corporation. This is also a REIT, but it's Tokyo-based, so we wanted to have geographical diversity on this call too. So they're a Tokyo-based REIT. They've got a diversified portfolio of holdings. What they do is they disclose SASB information in an ESG report available on the website. So the location is on the website in an ESG as part of an overall ESG report. So as you can see from the slide, it's another good example of the disclosure broken down. We call that disaggregated, broken down by different segments of the company's business. And so here it's important because energy management strategies can vary considerably depending on what kind of property you're talking about. So if it's at a hotel and a retail property, absent the COVID world, usage is particularly high, usually in those kinds of properties, and so you have a different perspective on the metrics in those particular business segments than you would in other parts of their portfolio. And so this breakdown helps investors compare the various segments of their diversified portfolio to the performance of other REITs that may specialize in a specific type of property. So anytime you've got a diversified business, multiple different businesses alone, multiple different businesses combined, this is not a conglomerate, but it's a REIT that operates in very different markets and different property types. Breaking it down is important for your own strategy for managing it as a business, but also to be transparent about it to investors so that investors understand where you're going and how you might be able to change that over time. Lastly, I just want to point out at the bottom, at the bottom of the table in the notes where United has provided some good context on what calculations they do, what were the methodologies that they used, what were the reporting boundaries, what was the scope of what they looked at, because that could be extremely helpful to ensure comparability between their REIT and other REITs. What SASB is attempting to do is make things as comparable as possible, but to the extent that companies can, in their disclosures, give that extra mile of providing the actual methodology and approach they used, then you could understand how they are actually calculating it and making sure that it ties well to the way other companies are doing it. And also, frankly, as an investor, you want to make sure that the company is reporting it in the same way with the same methodology year after year, or if they change it, you understand the implication of that change. SASB has application guidance. The SASB application guidance that you could find on the SASB's website actually has really good information on how to provide useful context around your SASB disclosures like these, and other considerations. I'll do one more, Neil, in the interest of time. I'll go through Kinder Morgan fairly quickly. It's a North American energy infrastructure company, primarily in the oil and gas industry. So one of the key points here is a user-friendly data download. The company reports metrics from 5 different SASB industry standards because they're in multiple industries. So it addresses one of the key points that we did in the rapid fire round earlier. But they also go a step further. They provide an Excel file with all of its ESG data. So obviously, it should go without saying that every investor's information needs are unique. If you provide the data in a usable way, in a usable format for the investor to download and actually put it to their own use and put it into their own model, it's very, very helpful. So, it could be the raw numbers that's most helpful for a particular investor. It could be the normalized information. Either way, if you provide the data in an Excel spreadsheet, that goes beyond, above and beyond what the SASB, standard would say you have to do. But it's somebody who's doing something to try to make it as easy as possible for investors to use. So those are some examples. I hope those proved helpful. Neil, I'll turn it back to you.
Great examples, Mark. Thank you very much. And just before we go to questions, I want to remind our audience again about our implementation primer. We launched this at the beginning of 2020. It's really an excellent interactive guide to getting started and moving through the process of SASB implementation, right from the governance and establishing a foundation and rounding up the right teams to choosing where to report, including these different channels that we've been talking about. Also has excellent worksheets that you can download and use to work through the process. So I recommend a visit to there. How to ask questions. If you haven't already, we'd encourage you to ask questions. You can see I'll show you some instructions here. There's a box on your screen. If you can't see the control panel like this, click the little red arrow to expand it, and then you can type in a question toward the bottom there under questions. I'll go now. I want to give one to Sophia first. And, considering again that we're really focused on the investors and audience here, Kathy Cole had a good question about, some of the biggest challenges you faced originally, but also Fiona Ortiz asked, could you go into more detail about the journey, what the journey has been like with your IR team? And Stephen Arport from Arizona State University adds, he says, first, my class discussed your ESG report yesterday. So your subject of class discussions, lots of interest, he said. And he wonders, have you continued attracting longer term investors that could be attributable to your ESG reporting? So question about IR, question about attracting investors, and really the connection here with investor relations.
Yeah, absolutely. IR departments are reflections of your investor base. And it's kind of tempting to say, oh, IR doesn't listen to me or IR doesn't want to do it. And frequently that's the reality. I think my IR colleagues wouldn't be shy in agreeing that that's the baseline where we started our conversations. The way I broke through to IR and they broke through to me was by talking about what the investors want. And that's why SASB is a shortcut to explaining to your investors that this is what the shareholders want. This is what the owners want. This is what the stewards of your capital want. And I actually said sentences like, This isn't about my ego. This isn't about because I want to put my precious report on your IR website. This is simply me being a channel and a pass-through for what our owners want. There's an analyst on my team. I'll give her a shout out. Phenomenal person and researcher, Tyler Fagenbaum. And she put together an intense spreadsheet of our top shareholders, noting for IR in each column in the Excel, if they wanted SASB, if they wanted TCFD, if they were signatories to PRI, where they said it, how they said it, quotes from their CEOs or the PMs, all in the spreadsheet. And we really overwhelmed any naysayers with data. And I think that's another mantra you can hold on to. This is about data. So if you're having trouble communicating to your internal stakeholders that you should put data out there, use data on the owners of your capital to convince them. That's the first thing. And I think, Neil, I can't lie, I've already forgotten the second question.
It really, that covers a lot of it. I mean, our Arizona State University student was asking, can you attribute additional or incremental new shareholders, long-term shareholders to the ESG reporting?
Yes, absolutely. Get on the Bloomberg terminal and see if your company or your client's company are in any ESG ETFs or funds. We did that, and JetBlue currently, as you know, the last time we checked a couple of days ago, is in 8 funds tagged ESG. You cannot get into those funds if you do not present ESG information. You can't rely on other people to sell and buy your shares. That's why you have an IR department. You don't want to let third parties tell your story. So IR and I we've had conversations now, clearly we report already, but if you're at an earlier stage in your conversation with IR, you can talk about it in regards to giving IR control to tell your own story. If you do not put out a comprehensive, data-driven, SASB, TCFD-aligned ESG report, you're not allowing, the IR department isn't allowing themselves to tell the stories, and other people will tell it for you, and the result is that you're less likely to get into ESG tag funds, who, as I'm sure most of the people on this call have seen, are outperforming the market, growing exponentially, et cetera.
Right. Thank you, Sophia.
Can I add to that, Neil? I mean, this goes back to what's driving this is the asset owners. Again, so we talked about insurance companies. The other biggest asset owner are pension funds. And again, 30-year liabilities that they're trying to cover. And so they are, insurance companies and pension funds are giving money to asset managers and saying, we want you to invest these, and we want you to invest these so that we could recover our money over 30 years, not 30 weeks, not 30 days, right? And so they are pushing the asset managers to think longer term. Stop thinking about, gross margin every single quarter, but think about the longer term. Then the asset managers, I'm not going to pretend that they're all there, because they're not. There's still a continuum. But more and more of them are getting to the point where they need to be thinking about and integrating ESG in one form or another, even if for no other reason than to satisfy the need of their customers, which is the asset owners, and to get more money. And if you look at funds flow from Morningstar data, if you look at research from Harvard, if you look at State Street data, if you look at all these different elements are showing more and more funds, one in every $4 is being invested in ESG directly. And even beyond that, just the integration of a firm like Wellington or Neuberger Berman, where they're coming out and saying that this is critical, and integrating ESG analysts and the portfolio managers directly in their fundamental analysis.
You're so right. Tremendous shift on the buy side. And we haven't even touched on the new generation of investors, of millennials and their values. The pension funds 30-year liabilities is one aspect of this, but there's a lot of other dimensions. We got time for a whole nother webinar on it, Mark. We'll get into that. A question for you, Mark, it's been several people are asking about assurance. And for example, Anka Anachi asks, do the sustainability reports not integrated in the 10K need to be assured or attested? Can you speak to that, Mark?
Sure. What we have seen is, and this is really, really rough and really, really raw, but about 30% of the reporters have some level of assurance one way, shape, or form, and that's irrespective of where the assurance where the information is located. And so frankly, this just reflects, and Sophia talked about the journey, and it took 10 years or 12 years for the maturity of this to get to the point where JetBlue is today. Assurance is on that continuum of maturity, and so again, don't let it stop you from getting started. The fact that it's not assured yet, or who's doing the assurance. Get started, get some information out there. Let's try to iterate that each year with better quality, better information. And assurance should be part of your thought process in that over time, and the level of assurance that you can get. I talked about Vornado getting a examination report that's actually beyond the standard. Most assurance reports that we see are review reports, which is sort of a negative level of assurance. Nothing jumped out at us to make us think that it wasn't in conformance with the framework. So there are different levels of assurance that you can do that will marry up with and be complementary to where you are in your maturity cycle and your reporting cycle.
For a second.
Neil, you back?
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry about
Okay.
that. My internet hung up for just a moment. Thanks for that, Mark. And a related question for you, Sophia, about assurance, and that Andra Duke asks if external assurance helped JetBlue in developing your ESG disclosures, the quality of the data or compliance requirements of different frameworks such as SASB.
Yeah. Again, you take it from what the owners of the capital are asking for, what the asset owners are asking for. And when we see them back things like CDP asks for assurance. So that was our first foray into assurance. And we had at a base our carbon offset, our carbon footprint, our amount of externality of carbon assured, because as an airline, we know that's our most material number and the number most likely to be questioned. So that's how we stepped into assurance. We have not assured, for example, the full report or gone beyond that, and I can see that going forward in the future. And this is, as Mark said, an evolution. And just to paint the full line here, it started with, oh, well, we don't need a report because they don't ask questions on quarterly calls. Well, they don't ask questions on quarterly calls because you're talking about quarterly earnings, right? Oh, but they didn't ask questions in the annual meeting. Well, there's a little bit of embarrassment here. I mean, there are now 700 people asking questions about how to do this. You can't expect the portfolio manager to come out in front of his or her entire industry and ask the question and be afraid to say something wrong. And be the wrong one to say. The place to have these questions and have these conversations, including about assurance with the asset owners, can frequently be in management access meetings, in smaller settings where you have, for example, like 10 funds with some of the higher levels of management, and you can ask them about assurance there. Some of them might not even have gone there in their head, but the second you say, should we get this assured, they're going to be like, do you get your financial information assured? Why wouldn't you? They're trying to streamline this the same. But again, I would look at assuring your largest material risk as a data point to start assurance.
Great point, Sophia. Thank you. And just to remind our audience, from SASB's point of view, we do not require assurance. However, we make it very clear that we believe that this information is to be decision useful for investors. It has to be investor grade, and that means it has to be prepared with the same kinds of internal controls and assurances as financial data. So going on, and some good questions for you, Sophia. One is, what are the advantages, or what encouragement will you give to first movers to incorporate SASB standards in a new industry or a new geography? What benefits are there to being a first mover? So JetBlue has been through this, and that's from Bronwyn Forsyth.
Yeah, I mean, there is power in the pen. When you're the first mover within your set of competitors or within your industry, your asset owners will come to you. I have multiple stories of us being called down to literal Wall Street or you know, West Avenue and next to Wall Street, where our major owners' headquarters are, and having them ask us for over an hour, why did you choose SASB? How did you choose SASB? How did you do this? How come your competitors aren't doing this? Do you think this is too time intensive? Do you think this is cost prohibitive? And when we say no, we know that they're leaving that management access meeting and going to another management access meeting with our competitors, and we have seen this kind of ripple effect. But when you're the first in your industry, you're doing something new for the asset owner. When you're kind of 100th, there's no learnings in there internally. And this is a very, very safe space to be first. It's scary to be first to say Black Lives Matter. You know, it's scary to be first to put out a 2050 carbon neutral goal, including scope 3. This is not scary. This is a good, safe place to lead where the money is backing you up and saying, yes, you can do this.
Great point. Okay. And, you know, related to this, it's about getting buy-in, Sophia. So a question from Catherine Gordon, and she says that, you know, her client's board has been asked questions about ESG, but management and IR haven't been directly questioned. Back to your point about there's no questions in the earnings call. So they're less convinced that investors are interested in a smaller or medium-sized company. It's a big disconnect. So related to that, Laura Rutledge asks about getting board of directors buy-in. The board of directors doesn't seem to realize that the resources that are needed, and so how to convince them that more than 3 hours a week of one person's time is needed to tackle sustainability.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start with the 3 questions there. Let's start with the small, medium enterprise. I actually think SMEs are the biggest frontier for ESG. They're where we're going to see the most progress in reducing emissions, in addressing social issues. I think they're going to come through as the heroes in this story in the next 0 to 5 years, as kind of Fortune 100 companies have their stake in the ground. They've righted the ESG ship, and now they're just driving in, and the cat's a little bit out of the bag that ESG funds are frequently just Google and Microsoft and Facebook because they bought 100% RECs for their renewable energy. And so investors are going to start going deeper and looking deeper. The small, medium enterprise with the most externalities that haven't been saved or addressed is where there's the most profit to be found, the most money to be saved. You know, you kind of put on your private equity lens when you think about ESG and small, medium enterprises. Second, how do you prove to your internal stakeholders and communicate to them that this matters when they're not asking, even in management access meetings? So let's say you have a management access meeting with BlackRock and ESG doesn't come up, and your IR department says, see, I told you so. It's like, well, that's okay, because Larry Fink, who's that woman or guy's boss, said so. So let's not put so much pressure on the individual PM. You know, this PM could be covering over 100 automotive companies, and they have 20 minutes of time with the IR department, and they have some very specific questions they want to ask. Or, you know, to use an example from the airline industry, they have 20 minutes and they need to talk about whether Easter fell in the first or second quarter. That doesn't mean that Larry Fink's words are irrelevant. So if you're not getting it from your PM, look to the corporate word. There's no shame in having a team member being an analyst, looking on the website and using that as your evidence. And then, of course, there was a third and final point, which, true to my brand, I've forgotten.
Just about resources, and how to get the resources needed. And I'm sorry, but well, actually, I need to cut you off because we're coming to the top of the hour, and I want to make sure that we conclude this in time. But just to follow that up, I mean, Mark, do you want to add anything on what Sophia's been saying before we wrap up?
Just real quickly, I got to dispel the myth about the earnings call. I was an analyst. I would never ask a question on the earnings call because I didn't want Fidelity and Wellington and anybody else to know what I was thinking. Okay, so the earnings call belies the information that actually the buy side truly cares about, right? And so and Sophia also said the information that's provided on the earnings call is financially oriented. So why would you then ask something else about something that's not directly related to that? So the earnings call, while it's the most obvious and transparent thing that management sees and the board sees, actually does not represent the view of what the buy side is. And that's why I go back to the asset owners, the asset managers, and the funds flow. And that's
Great.
where you actually get the data to understand what's really happening out there.
Excellent point. Well, that brings part 3 of our SASB Implementation Webinar Series to a conclusion. And thank you very much to EY partner and member of our Standards Board, Mark Siegel, and JetBlue's Chief Sustainability Officer, Sophia Mendelson. It's been a pleasure. Thank you both. Please join us for the final part of this series on Friday, June 26th, when we'll have SASB Investor Advisory Group member Franklin Templeton, as well as Medtronic, along with my colleague Marvin Smith, who leads SASB's Standards Advisory Group. The theme of that episode will include how to get involved in SASB's standard setting process. So in light of that, I would also like to invite you to the next quarterly meeting of our Standards Board next week, June 23rd, 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 Eastern, 6 p.m. in Europe. These meetings are public. You're invited to join the event to hear Mark in action, along with the 8 other Standards Board members and SASB's research team. Learn about our research projects, learn about potential updates to the standards. Thank you very much to our live webinar participants for joining us today, and thank you for your questions. We would love to hear more from you, info@sasb.org. I'm Neil Stewart, Director of Corporate Outreach for SASB. Goodbye.